Charles Taylor is the only African head of state since the Nuremberg trials to be convicted of war crimes by an international tribunal, and when you learn what he did, the verdict feels like an understatement. Born in Liberia in 1948 and educated in the United States, Taylor returned to Africa and entered government under President Samuel Doe, only to be accused of embezzling nearly $1 million in state funds and jailed. He escaped, reportedly through a U.S. prison, made his way to Libya, trained as a guerrilla fighter, and in 1989 launched a rebel invasion of Liberia that plunged the country into a brutal civil war lasting until 1996. More than 150,000 people were killed. More than half the population became refugees. In 1997, Taylor was elected president in an election many observers described as deeply coerced. Voters feared that rejecting him would simply restart the war. Their fears proved well-founded either way. As president, Taylor extended his reach into neighboring Sierra Leone, where he armed and directed the Revolutionary United Front, a rebel group that became notorious for one of the most horrific signature atrocities in modern warfare, the systematic amputation of civilians' hands, arms, and legs. The RUF did this to children, to farmers, to women, to anyone who stood in their path. In exchange, Taylor received blood diamonds, which he used to fund more weapons and more war. Over 50,000 people were killed in Sierra Leone's civil war. Tens of thousands more were mutilated for life. Taylor was indicted in 2003, forced from power, and eventually tried at The Hague. In 2012, he was found guilty on all 11 counts: terror, murder, rape, enslavement, and the use of child soldiers, and sentenced to 50 years in a British prison. He remains there today. Unlike so many others on this list, Charles Taylor actually faced justice. For his hundreds of thousands of victims, it was the least the world could do. The story of Robert Mugabe is one of history's most painful paradoxes. A man who genuinely helped liberate his country from white minority rule, and then spent the next 37 years destroying it from within. Mugabe was a freedom fighter, a teacher, an intellectual who spent 11 years in a Rhodesian prison for his political activities, and who emerged to lead Zimbabwe to independence in 1980 as one of Africa's most celebrated leaders. The early years of his rule brought real gains: expanded education, improved healthcare, and a spirit of national reconciliation that impressed the world. But within just 3 years of taking power, a much darker Mugabe emerged. In 1983, Mugabe deployed his 5th Brigade, a military unit trained specifically by North Korea, into the Matabeleland region, home of the Ndebele people and supporters of his political rival Joshua Komu. What followed became known as the Gukurahundi, a Shona word meaning the wind that sweeps away the chaff. It was genocide. The 5th Brigade conducted public executions, mass burials, systematic torture, and imposed food blockades on entire communities during drought conditions, deliberately engineering starvation. Estimates of those killed range from 20,000 to 80,000 people. Mugabe denied it was happening. When presented with documented evidence by Catholic clergy, he dismissed it as lies. No one was ever prosecuted. In later decades, Mugabe's violence became economic as well. His forced seizure of white-owned farms after 2000, handed to political allies with no farming knowledge, collapsed Zimbabwe's agricultural output by 60% and triggered hyperinflation that reached 7,600% by 2007. People could not afford bread. He was ousted by his own party in a 2017 military coup and died in Singapore in 2019 at age 95, receiving a state funeral in a country he had systematically broken. The men and women of Matabeleland, still waiting for acknowledgement, received nothing. Joseph Kony may be the most purely evil figure on this entire list, a man with no coherent ideology, no political program, and no goal beyond the perpetuation of his own power through the weaponization of children. Born in 1961 in northern Uganda, Kony grew up in the volatile aftermath of Idi Amin's fall and the civil conflict that followed. In 1987, claiming to be a spirit medium receiving divine instructions, he founded the Lord's Resistance Army, initially framing it as a movement to defend Uganda's Akoli people against the government of President Museveni. Within years, any pretense of a political cause had collapsed. What the LRA became was something else entirely, a machine for abduction, mutilation, and terror. Kony's primary weapon was children. The LRA abducted an estimated 66,000 children over the course of its existence, boys and girls as young as 8. Boys were forced to become soldiers, often made to kill their own parents or siblings as initiation, ensuring that returning home became psychologically impossible. Girls were distributed as wives to LRA commanders or used as sexual slaves. Children who resisted, tried to escape, or disobeyed were killed, often by other children, in ritualized group killings designed to traumatize survivors into compliance. Kony convinced his soldiers that holy water made them bulletproof. He mutilated civilians, cutting off noses, lips, and hands to spread terror through communities across Uganda, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The ICC issued an arrest warrant for Kony in 2005. He has never been captured. As of this recording, he is believed to be hiding somewhere in the border region of Sudan and the Central African Republic, leading a much-reduced force. He has caused the displacement of over 2 million people. He remains one of the world's most wanted fugitives and one of the most monstrous figures of the last century. Francisco Macias Nguema is not a name most people know, but in per capita terms, he may have been the most destructive dictator in African history. Nguema became the first president of Equatorial Guinea when the small Central African nation gained independence from Spain in 1968. Within a year, the mask was off. He declared himself president for life, banned political parties, abolished the independent judiciary, and gave himself titles including Unique Miracle and Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture. A darkly ironic title from a man who would soon be responsible for the near-total destruction of his country's educated class. Nguema governed through paranoia and terror, so extreme it defied comprehension. He ordered the execution of anyone who wore eyeglasses, viewing literacy and education as threats to his power. He had members of his own government killed. He executed political rivals on Christmas Eve 1969, while loudspeakers played "Those Were the Days" by Mary Hopkin, a detail so grotesque it sounds invented. By the time his reign ended, an estimated one-third of Equatorial Guinea's entire population had either been killed or driven into exile. That is a proportion of loss that rivals the Cambodian genocide under Pol Pot. Nguema dismantled the banking system, hid the national treasury in his house, and at one point banned the word intellectual. He shuttered schools, closed churches, and presided over a country slipping back toward the Stone Age while he clung to power through sheer brutality. He was finally overthrown in 1979 by his own nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, who tried and executed him by firing squad. Obiang, now notorious in his own right as one of Africa's longest-serving dictators, replaced one nightmare with another. Equatorial Guinea has never fully recovered from what Macias Nguema did to it. In 100 days in the spring of 1994, Rwanda experienced one of the fastest, most concentrated episodes of mass murder in human history. An estimated 800,000 to 1 million people, predominantly from the Tutsi ethnic group, were killed by neighbors, colleagues, even family members, in a genocide orchestrated with chilling precision. At the center of that machinery was Jean Kambanda, the Prime Minister of Rwanda during the genocide, and the first head of government in history to plead guilty to the crime of genocide before an international tribunal. Kambanda was appointed Prime Minister on April 8, 1994, the very day after President Habyarimana's plane was shot down, the event that triggered the killing. He was not a passive bystander swept up in events. He was an active participant and architect. He attended meetings where lists of Tutsi targets were distributed. He provided arms and ammunition to militia groups conducting the massacres. He made radio broadcasts on the notorious RTLM station, the same station that had been calling Tutsis Inyenzi, cockroaches, and inciting their extermination, legitimizing and encouraging the killing at a moment when a single word from the Prime Minister might have slowed it. He did not use that word. He chose the other direction entirely. In 1997, Kambanda was arrested in Kenya and transferred to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. In 1998, he pleaded guilty, the confession coming in exchange for, he hoped, a lighter sentence. The judges were not moved. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the tribunal noting that his position of authority and his active encouragement of the genocide made his crimes among the most serious it had ever considered. He is currently serving that life sentence in Mali. He confessed. He was punished. But for the 800,000 people who died in 100 days, justice, however necessary, could never be enough. Nigeria is the most populous nation in Africa, a country of enormous human talent, vast oil wealth, and profound potential. In the 1990s, that potential was held hostage by one man, General Sani Abacha, a military dictator who looted his country with an efficiency that stunned even seasoned observers of African corruption. Abacha came to power in a 1993 coup, seizing control after annulling the results of a democratic election that had been broadly accepted as free and fair. He then proceeded to run Nigeria like a personal ATM, stealing an estimated $3 to $5 billion in public funds, stashing the money in bank accounts across Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and beyond. When he died suddenly in 1998, investigators found that he and his associates had taken an amount equivalent to roughly 2% of Nigeria's entire GDP every single year of his rule. But Abacha was not merely a thief. He was a killer. His government arrested, tortured, and executed political opponents with systematic efficiency. The most famous of his victims was Ken Saro-Wiwa, a celebrated writer, environmental activist, and leader of the Ogoni people who had been peacefully protesting the environmental destruction caused by Shell Oil's operations in the Niger Delta. In November 1995, after a deeply flawed trial widely condemned by human rights organizations around the world, Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni activists were hanged. The executions triggered international outrage. Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth. But Abacha did not care. He was beyond accountability, or so he believed. He died in June 1998 under circumstances that remain disputed, reportedly in the company of Indian prostitutes supplied by an arms dealer. He was never tried. He was never punished. His family spent years negotiating the return of stolen funds, eventually returning some fraction of the billions taken, while ordinary Nigerians who had lived under his boot received nothing. In 2004, Transparency International ranked him the 4th most corrupt leader in modern world history.